The most dangerous misconception about the 2026 collapse is that it was the crisis. This is wrong. The collapse wasn't the crisis. It was the revelation of a crisis that had been building for decades. The difference matters enormously because it determines whether you're preparing for recovery or preparing for continuation. If 2026 was the crisis, then the worst is over. Recovery is the next phase. Rebuild what was broken, restore what was lost, return to normalcy. This is what most people believed in the immediate aftermath. This is what most institutions planned for. This is why most responses failed. If 2026 was the exposure of the crisis, then the actual crisis is ongoing. The worst isn't over. The collapse merely revealed underlying problems that still exist and may be worsening. Recovery isn't possible until the real crisis is addressed. And that crisis is structural, not cyclical. Understanding why 2026 didn't end the crisis requires understanding what the actual crisis is, why it was hidden before 2026, how the collapse exposed it, and why it continues despite, or because of, the responses implemented. Let me show you exactly what 2026 revealed, why those revelations were ignored or misunderstood, and why the real crisis is still unfolding years after the initial collapse. The 2026 collapse stripped away the facade that had hidden fundamental problems. Like a receding tide revealing the rocks that had always been there, the collapse exposed structural issues that prosperity had obscured. The first revelation was the insolvency hiding behind complexity. The global financial system wasn't illiquid. It was insolvent. The distinction is critical. Illiquidity means you have assets but can't sell them quickly. Insolvency means your liabilities exceed your assets. You're broke. For decades, financial engineering had disguised insolvency as temporary liquidity problems, complex derivative structures, off-balance sheet vehicles, mark-to-model accounting instead of mark-to-market. These techniques made insolvent institutions appear merely illiquid. The 2026 collapse made the distinction impossible to ignore. When asset values collapsed and couldn't recover, the truth emerged. Many institutions, corporations, and governments weren't facing temporary cash flow problems. They had fundamental balance sheet problems. Their debts could never be repaid from their assets and income. They were permanently impaired. This revelation meant that liquidity solutions couldn't work. You can't solve insolvency by providing more credit. That just adds debt to an already unpayable debt burden. It delays the reckoning, but makes it worse when it arrives. Yet this is exactly what most policy responses attempted. The second revelation was resource constraints masquerading as market inefficiencies. The pre-collapse economy operated on the assumption that any shortage could be solved by proper pricing and market mechanisms. High prices would incentivize production. Production would increase supply. Supply would meet demand. Markets would clear. The collapse revealed that some constraints aren't price solvable. You can't produce more oil by raising prices if geological depletion means less oil is physically available. You can't grow more food by raising prices if soil degradation and water scarcity limit production. You can't generate more electricity if the grid infrastructure is fundamentally inadequate. Energy markets expose this most clearly. Oil prices spiked during the collapse, reaching levels that should have incentivized massive production increases. But production didn't increase significantly. Decades of underinvestment, maturing fields, and geological reality meant the high prices brought forth only modest new supply. The market couldn't solve the problem because the problem was physical, not financial. Food systems revealed similar constraints. Fertilizer shortages couldn't be solved by high prices when the natural gas needed to produce fertilizer was itself scarce. Water scarcity couldn't be priced away when aquifers were depleted and rainfall patterns had shifted. The market mechanism assumes elastic supply. Some supplies aren't elastic. The third revelation was political dysfunction hidden by prosperity. During good times, political systems can afford to be dysfunctional. Gridlock is annoying, but not catastrophic when the baseline is growth. Corruption is tolerable when there's enough wealth to skim while still delivering services. Incompetence can be masked by inherited institutional strength. The collapse removed the cushion of prosperity. Suddenly, dysfunction had immediate consequences. Governments that couldn't respond quickly lost legitimacy. Systems that couldn't coordinate failed catastrophically. Institutions hollowed out by corruption collapsed. The political crisis that had been developing for decades became undeniable. Democratic legitimacy eroded across developed nations. Voter turnout had been declining. Trust in institutions had been falling. Political polarization had been increasing. But these trends were abstract during prosperity. The collapse made them concrete. Governments couldn't respond effectively because they lacked both competence and legitimacy. Authoritarian systems faced different but equally severe problems. They had maintained control through economic performance. When performance collapsed, control mechanisms were tested. Some authoritarian governments tightened their grip successfully. Others faced instability they couldn't suppress. The facade of authoritarian efficiency cracked. The fourth revelation was social fragmentation concealed by material comfort. The pre-collapse society was far less cohesive than it appeared. Communities were atomized. Social trust was low. Civic participation had declined, but these problems were manageable when everyone could retreat into private consumption. The collapse destroyed that option. Suddenly, people needed their communities. They needed neighbors. They needed social networks. And they discovered those networks had atrophied. The social capital required to navigate crisis had been depleted by decades of individualistic consumerism. Some communities had maintained social cohesion and discovered they could respond effectively to crisis. Others found they were collections of strangers living in proximity with no shared identity or mutual obligation. These communities struggled or failed entirely. The collapse was a test of social capital, and many societies failed the test. The fifth revelation was ecological degradation masked by technology. Environmental problems had been accumulating for decades: soil erosion, water depletion, biodiversity loss, climate change. These were known issues, but seemed manageable through technological solutions. The collapse revealed that the problems had progressed beyond technological fixes. Soil erosion couldn't be reversed by precision agriculture when the topsoil was gone. Water scarcity couldn't be solved by efficient irrigation when the aquifers were depleted. Climate impacts couldn't be adapted to when the changes were accelerating beyond adaptation capacity. The ecological crisis wasn't something happening in the future. It was already here, degrading the foundation of the economy. The collapse removed the technological and financial buffers that had made the degradation invisible. The ecological crisis became undeniable. The sixth revelation was demographic time bombs disguised as manageable trends: aging populations, declining birth rates, dependency ratios. These were known, but seemed like slow-moving problems that could be addressed gradually through policy adjustments. The collapse accelerated these trends and revealed their severity. Pension systems depended on investment returns that disappeared. Healthcare systems depended on economic growth that stopped. Social support systems depended on working-age populations that were shrinking. The demographic crisis wasn't a future problem. It was current reality. These six revelations: financial insolvency, resource constraints, political dysfunction, social fragmentation, ecological degradation, and demographic imbalance, weren't created by the 2026 collapse. They existed before. The collapse simply made them visible. And making them visible didn't solve them. Despite the clarity of what 2026 revealed, the revelations were widely misunderstood or deliberately misinterpreted. This misunderstanding determined the response, and the response determined the ongoing crisis. The primary misunderstanding was treating symptoms as causes. The credit freeze was a symptom of underlying insolvency, not the cause of the crisis. But policy responses focused on restoring credit, not addressing insolvency. This was like treating a fever without addressing the infection. Why did this happen? Because treating symptoms is easier than addressing root causes. Providing liquidity is something central banks know how to do. Writing off bad debts and restructuring entire industries is politically impossible. So, authorities did what they could do, not what needed to be done. The second misunderstanding was assuming cyclicality. Most economic problems in the prior century had been cyclical. Recessions happened, then recoveries followed. The pattern was so consistent that it became assumed. The 2026 collapse was interpreted through this lens: a severe recession that would eventually reverse. This interpretation was comforting, but wrong. The revealed problems weren't cyclical. Resource depletion doesn't reverse. Ecological degradation doesn't naturally heal at economic timescales. Social fragmentation doesn't automatically repair. Demographic trends don't quickly shift. These are structural, not cyclical, but acknowledging structural problems means acknowledging that simple recovery isn't coming, that the old normal is gone permanently, that fundamental transformation is required. This is psychologically and politically unacceptable. So, the cyclical interpretation persisted despite evidence against it. The third misunderstanding was technological optimism. The pre-collapse era had seen remarkable technological advancement. Computing power increased exponentially, communication became instantaneous, information became abundant. These advances created faith that technology would solve any problem. This faith persisted after the collapse. The energy crisis would be solved by new energy technology. The food crisis would be solved by agricultural innovation. The climate crisis would be solved by geoengineering. Technology would save us, as it always had. But this ignored that previous technological solutions had often just displaced problems. The Green Revolution increased food production but depleted soil and water. Fossil fuels provided abundant energy but created climate change. Antibiotics saved lives but created resistant bacteria. Technology is powerful, but it's not magic. The revealed crises were, in many cases, created by previous technological solutions. Believing that more technology would solve problems created by technology required ignoring this pattern. But people did ignore it because the alternative, acknowledging that technology has limits, was too frightening. The fourth misunderstanding was political scapegoating. Rather than acknowledge systemic problems, political actors blamed specific groups. The collapse was caused by greedy bankers, by incompetent regulators, by corrupt politicians, by foreign adversaries, by immigrants, by the wealthy, by the poor. Each group had their preferred scapegoat. And scapegoating is psychologically satisfying. It provides someone to blame. It suggests simple solutions. Punish the guilty and problems will resolve. It avoids the uncomfortable truth that systemic problems transcend individual bad actors. But scapegoating prevented accurate diagnosis. If you believe the crisis was caused by banker greed, you focus on regulating bankers. If you believe it was caused by government incompetence, you focus on changing government. Neither addresses the underlying structural problems, because those problems exist regardless of who's in charge or how well they behave. The fifth misunderstanding was normalcy bias. Humans have strong psychological resistance to believing that fundamental change is occurring. We expect tomorrow to resemble yesterday. This bias is usually adaptive. Most days are normal. But it becomes maladaptive during genuine transformation. After the collapse, normalcy bias produced expectations that things would return to pre-collapse conditions. Markets would recover, growth would resume. The disruption was temporary. This expectation drove behavior and policy. People and institutions prepared for return to normal rather than adaptation to new reality. Years into the ongoing crisis, normalcy bias still operates. Each quarter, analysts expect recovery. Each year, forecasters predict return to growth. The predictions are consistently wrong, but they keep being made. Admitting that normal isn't returning requires overcoming deeply ingrained psychological resistance. The sixth misunderstanding was confusing resilience with recovery. Some systems and communities did recover from the initial collapse shock. Local production systems were rebuilt. Community governance structures were established. These successes were interpreted as general recovery. But recovering from immediate crisis isn't the same as solving underlying problems. A community that establishes local food production shows resilience. But if that community is using methods that deplete soil, the resilience is temporary. They've recovered from the collapse but haven't addressed the ecological crisis. True resilience requires addressing root causes, but that's harder and slower than symptom management. So communities celebrated recovery while the underlying crisis continued to develop. The misunderstanding of what 2026 revealed led to responses that extended rather than resolved the crisis. Well-intentioned policies, implemented by competent people, made the underlying problems worse. Monetary policy responded with massive liquidity provision. Central banks created trillions in new money. They bought assets at inflated values. They provided emergency lending at subsidized rates. The goal was to prevent deflationary collapse and restore normal credit conditions. In the short term, this worked. It prevented complete financial system collapse. Markets stabilized, credit conditions improved marginally, but the medium-term consequences were severe. The liquidity provision prevented necessary deleveraging. Insolvent institutions that should have failed were kept alive. Zombie companies that couldn't survive without subsidized credit continued operating. Malinvestment that should have been liquidated was preserved. The financial system remained fragile because its weakest components weren't removed. Inflation emerged as an inevitable consequence. Creating trillions in new money while production capacity was constrained meant too much money chasing too few goods. Central banks insisted inflation was transitory. It wasn't. It became embedded in expectations and wage price dynamics. The inflation hurt most those least able to bear it. Wealthy individuals had assets that appreciated with inflation. Poor individuals had wages that lagged inflation. The monetary response, intended to prevent depression, instead transferred wealth upward and created social tension. Fiscal policy responded with massive spending. Governments borrowed and spent trillions to support displaced workers, subsidize struggling industries, and maintain public services. The spending prevented complete social collapse, but created new problems. The debt burdens became unsustainable. Countries already carrying high debt loads added enormously to them. Debt to GDP ratios exceeded levels previously considered dangerous. This worked temporarily because interest rates were suppressed, but it created vulnerability to any future rate increases. When inflation forced interest rates higher, debt service costs exploded. Governments faced a choice: default, inflate away the debt, or cut services dramatically. Each option was politically catastrophic. So governments tried a bit of each, creating confused policy and extended pain. The fiscal spending also prevented necessary economic restructuring. Industries that weren't viable in the post-collapse economy were kept alive by subsidies. Workers were paid to stay in jobs that no longer made economic sense. Resources were locked in unproductive uses rather than reallocating to productive ones. Regulatory responses tightened controls on the financial system. Higher capital requirements, more strict leverage limits, enhanced supervision. These rules were meant to prevent future crises by making the system more stable. But the regulations made the credit crunch worse. Banks facing higher capital requirements lent less. Businesses that couldn't get credit couldn't invest or expand. The regulations made the system safer in theory, but less functional in practice. And safety without functionality isn't actually safe. The regulations also created moral hazard. By making the system appear safer, they encouraged greater risk-taking by those who believed they were protected. The too-big-to-fail problem wasn't solved, it was entrenched. Large institutions knew they'd be rescued because they were too important to allow to fail. Industrial policy attempted to address specific shortages. Governments identified critical supply chains and subsidized domestic production. Semiconductor fabrication, pharmaceutical manufacturing. Clean energy technology. The goal was to reduce vulnerability to foreign supply disruptions. These policies created protected industries that were inefficient and dependent on continued subsidy. Without competitive pressure, they didn't innovate or improve productivity. They became rent-seeking cartels, extracting wealth from the broader economy. The security gained was real but expensive. The industrial policy also created international tensions. One country's domestic production is another country's lost exports. As countries subsidized domestic industries, global trade contracted. The efficiencies from specialization and comparative advantage were lost. Everyone became poorer through protection. Social policies attempted to address inequality and discontent. Wealth taxes, universal basic income pilots, expanded welfare systems. The goal was to maintain social cohesion and political stability by reducing inequality. These policies faced the fundamental problem that there was less wealth to redistribute. Taxing wealth when asset values had collapsed generated limited revenue. Providing income when productive capacity was reduced created inflation. The policies were humane in intent but limited in effectiveness. They also created dependency. People receiving support had less incentive to adapt to new economic realities. Why learn new skills when universal basic income provides subsistence? Why start a business when regulation and taxation make it difficult? The social support, meant to be temporary, became permanent. Climate policies accelerated in response to revealed ecological crisis. Carbon taxes, renewable energy mandates, electric vehicle requirements. The policies were necessary. Climate change is real and dangerous, but the implementation was problematic. The policies imposed costs on an economy that couldn't bear them. Forcing expensive energy transitions when the economy was contracting created hardship. People choosing between heating and eating don't care about 2050 emission targets. The political backlash against climate policy grew stronger precisely when action was most necessary. The policies also displaced rather than solved problems. Electric vehicles reduce emissions, but require massive mining for battery materials. That mining creates environmental damage and social disruption. Solar panels require materials produced using fossil fuels. The energy transition is necessary, but not as clean as advertised. Years after 2026, the crisis continues because the underlying problems revealed by the collapse haven't been addressed. Some have worsened. The responses implemented have, in many cases, made resolution harder. The insolvency problem persists. Debt levels remain unsustainable. Zombie institutions remain alive on life support. Malinvestment hasn't been liquidated. The financial system remains fragile because the balance sheet problems were never resolved. The next shock will reveal this fragility again. Every attempt to address insolvency through inflation has political and social costs that eventually force policy reversal. Every attempt to address it through austerity creates economic contraction that makes the debt burden worse. Every attempt to address it through growth hits resource and ecological constraints. The problem is structurally unsolvable within existing frameworks. The resource constraints have tightened. Energy production hasn't increased to meet demand. Many fields and mines are depleting faster than new sources are developed. Technological improvements in efficiency haven't offset physical scarcity. Energy costs remain elevated, constraining economic activity. Water scarcity has worsened in many regions. Aquifers continue depleting. Climate change is altering rainfall patterns. Agricultural productivity is declining in areas that once were productive. Food security is decreasing rather than increasing. The market can't solve physical scarcity. Mineral resources face similar issues. Copper, lithium, cobalt, rare earths, all are required for the energy transition, but are increasingly difficult and expensive to extract. The energy transition requires materials that require energy to produce. It's a catch-22 that hasn't been resolved. The political dysfunction has deepened. Trust in institutions continues declining. Political polarization has intensified. Governments face legitimacy crises and struggle to implement any coherent policy. The political system can't respond effectively to crisis because it's in crisis itself. Democratic systems are gridlocked by polarization. Authoritarian systems are paralyzed by fear of instability. International cooperation is broken down. Each country pursues narrow self-interest, making coordination on global problems impossible. Climate change, pandemic response, trade, all require cooperation that doesn't exist. The political crisis creates a vicious cycle. Economic problems create political instability. Political instability prevents effective economic policy. Failed policy deepens economic problems. The cycle continues with no obvious exit. The social fragmentation has accelerated. Communities have splintered along ideological lines. Urban-rural divides have widened. Generational conflicts have intensified. Class resentment has grown. The social cohesion required to address collective problems has evaporated. Social media and information bubbles have made the fragmentation worse. Different groups live in different realities with different facts. Consensus is impossible when people can't agree on basic reality. Policy requires some level of shared understanding. That shared understanding doesn't exist. The fragmentation also manifests geographically. Successful regions pull away from struggling regions. Coastal cities versus interior towns. Resource-rich areas versus resource-poor. The inequality is geographic and creates political tensions that prevent national solutions. The ecological crisis has progressed. Climate impacts are accelerating. Extreme weather is more frequent and severe. Ecosystems are collapsing. Species are going extinct at unprecedented rates. The changes are happening faster than adaptation efforts. Feedback loops are engaging. Arctic ice melt reduces albedo, causing more warming. Permafrost thaw releases methane, causing more warming. Forest dieback reduces carbon absorption, causing more warming. Each change makes the next change more likely and severe. The window for preventing catastrophic climate change has probably closed. The question now is how catastrophic it becomes, and whether civilization can adapt. Current trends suggest adaptation will be difficult or impossible in many regions. Mass displacement and resource conflicts seem inevitable. The demographic crisis has worsened. Birth rates continue falling in developed countries. The working age population is shrinking. The dependent population is growing. The economic burden is increasing. Pension and healthcare systems are collapsing under the weight. Immigration could theoretically solve the demographic problem, but political opposition makes it impossible. Countries with aging populations need young workers. Countries with young populations need opportunities. But xenophobia and nationalism prevent the obvious solution. The combination of aging populations and economic contraction creates a death spiral. Fewer workers mean less production. Less production means less wealth. Less wealth means less support for the elderly. Less support creates social crisis. The crisis creates political dysfunction. Dysfunction prevents solutions. After examining what 2026 revealed, why it was misunderstood, how responses failed, and why problems continue, we can finally define the real crisis clearly. The real crisis is the collision between infinite growth expectations and finite planet reality. The entire modern economic system is predicated on continuous growth. Debt requires growth to be repayable. Pensions require growth to be fundable. Political legitimacy requires growth to maintain living standards. But growth has physical limits. For decades, technology and globalization allowed growth to continue by accessing new resources and markets. But those frontiers are closing. Resource extraction is hitting physical limits. Environmental sinks are saturated, markets are mature. The growth model is reaching its end. This doesn't mean zero growth forever. It means the period of exceptional growth, powered by fossil fuels and frontier expansion, is ending. Return to historical growth rates, much lower than modern expectations, is inevitable. But the entire system is built for 3% growth. It can't function at 0.5% growth. The financial system requires growth to service debt. Zero growth means debt defaults cascade. The pension system requires growth to pay retirees. Zero growth means pensions collapse. The political system requires growth to maintain legitimacy. Zero growth means political crisis. Everything is interconnected and depends on growth that isn't coming. The real crisis is also the mismatch between complex global systems and an increasingly fragmented localized world. The modern economy was built on global integration, complex supply chains, international division of labor, global capital flows. This integration created efficiency, but required political stability and cooperation. That stability and cooperation are gone. Geopolitical tensions are rising. Nationalism is increasing. Trust is declining. But the economic system still depends on global integration. The mismatch creates constant friction and crisis. Attempts to maintain globalization face political resistance. Attempts to localize face economic reality. The real crisis is the gap between institutional capacity and problem complexity. The challenges facing civilization, climate change, resource depletion, demographic shift, technological disruption, are unprecedented in scale and complexity. They require sophisticated, coordinated responses across decades. But institutional capacity is degraded and decreasing. Governments are less competent, less trusted, less capable. International institutions are weak or dysfunctional. Civil society is fragmented. The problems are getting harder, while the capacity to address them is getting weaker. The gap is widening. The real crisis is the erosion of the energy foundation of industrial civilization. Modern civilization is built on abundant, cheap energy. That energy came primarily from fossil fuels. Climate change requires moving away from fossil fuels, but alternatives don't provide the same abundance at the same price. Renewable energy is improving, but faces inherent limitations. Solar and wind are intermittent. Batteries are expensive and resource intensive. Nuclear faces political opposition. Fusion remains perpetually decades away. The energy transition is necessary, but there's no guarantee it's possible at the scale and speed required while maintaining industrial civilization. The real crisis is the behavioral and psychological inability to respond to slow-moving catastrophes. Humans are adapted to respond to immediate threats. We're not adapted to respond to threats that unfold over decades. Climate change, resource depletion, soil erosion, these kill us slowly, which means we don't respond until it's too late. The 2026 collapse was in some ways helpful because it made the crisis acute and immediate. But that immediate crisis has been partially stabilized. The slow-moving aspects continue, but they're not generating immediate pain that would force response. So they're ignored while attention focuses on immediate problems. Why this matters more than the collapse. Understanding that 2026 exposed rather than ended the crisis matters because it changes everything about how you think, prepare, and act. If 2026 was the crisis, you wait for recovery. You hold on to assets expecting appreciation. You maintain skills and relationships from the old economy. You believe normalcy will return. You're passive and patient. If 2026 exposed an ongoing crisis, you prepare for continuation and potential worsening. You shift to resilient assets. You develop practical skills. You build community relationships. You assume normalcy isn't returning. You're active and adaptive. The difference between these mindsets is the difference between surviving and thriving, between being prepared and being blindsided, between adapting successfully and failing to adapt at all. If 2026 was the crisis, policy should focus on restoration. Rebuild what was broken, restore what was lost, support institutions until they recover. This is what most policy is focused on. This is why it hasn't worked. If 2026 exposed an ongoing crisis, policy should focus on transformation. Build new systems adapted to new reality. Let failed institutions fail, support transition rather than preservation. This is harder politically and psychologically, but it's what's actually needed. If 2026 was the crisis, the economic focus should be on restarting growth. Stimulus spending, monetary easing. Business subsidies. Get the growth engine running again. This is what most economic policy has attempted. If 2026 exposed an ongoing crisis, the economic focus should be on adaptation to low growth or zero growth reality. Restructure debt, reform pensions. Build resilient local systems. Accept that some things can't be maintained. This is what hasn't been attempted at scale. If 2026 was the crisis, social policy should provide temporary support during disruption. Unemployment insurance to retraining programs, bridge assistance until normal employment returns. This is the current approach. If 2026 exposed an ongoing crisis, social policy should help people adapt to permanent transformation. Support for relocation from unsustainable areas. Education for new economic reality. Community building for resilience. Long-term adaptation assistance. This is what's needed but not provided. The recognition that 2026 exposed rather than ended the crisis also affects personal decisions. Career choices, location choices, investment choices, relationship choices, all should be made differently if you understand the crisis is ongoing. Careers and industries dependent on high growth and cheap energy are risky. Careers in resilience, adaptation, and basic needs provision are safer. Locations vulnerable to climate impacts, resource scarcity, or social fragmentation are dangerous. Locations with community cohesion and resource security are valuable. Investments in assets requiring stable institutions and growth are vulnerable. Investments in practical assets and local production capacity are resilient. Relationships based on convenience and economic benefit are fragile. Relationships based on mutual aid and shared values are durable. If the crisis is ongoing, what's the path forward? There isn't one path. There are many paths, and different communities, regions, and nations will take different ones. But some principles apply broadly. First, accept reality. The hardest step is acknowledging that return to pre-collapse normal isn't coming, that growth won't restart at previous levels, that many jobs and industries are gone permanently, that living standards will be lower. Acceptance is painful but necessary for effective response. Without acceptance, energy goes into denial and wishful thinking. With acceptance, energy can go into adaptation. The communities and individuals who accepted reality earliest have adapted most successfully. Those still in denial are still suffering. Second, build resilience at every level. Personal resilience through diverse skills and health. Family resilience through strong relationships and emergency preparation. Community resilience through social capital and local production. Regional resilience through resource security and governance capacity. Resilience is expensive, it's redundant, it's inefficient, but in a crisis-prone world, resilience is survival. The trade-off between efficiency and resilience has shifted dramatically. Optimization is no longer the goal. Robustness is, third, prioritize basics. Food, water, energy, shelter, security, health, everything else is secondary. Economies built on financial services, entertainment, and advertising are fragile. Economies built on producing actual necessities are durable. The 2026 collapse didn't end the crisis, it exposed the crisis. And that exposure was the most important event, not because it solved anything, but because it revealed everything. We now see clearly what was always true but hidden. The growth model is ending, the resource base is depleting, the climate is changing, the institutions are failing, the social fabric is tearing. We see the problems, we know what needs to be done. The question is whether we'll do it. Years after 2026, most responses still operate as if recovery to the old normal is possible, as if the crisis was temporary, as if growth will restart. This denial ensures continued failure. Only when the exposure is accepted can effective response begin. The communities, regions, and nations that have accepted the exposure are adapting, building resilient local systems, restructuring economies for low-growth reality, fostering social cohesion, addressing root causes. They're still struggling, everyone is, but they're at least struggling in the right direction. Those still denying the exposure are fighting losing battles, trying to preserve systems that can't be preserved, waiting for recovery that isn't coming, preparing for the wrong future. The denial is understandable. Accepting the exposure is psychologically devastating. But denial doesn't change reality. It just delays adaptation and makes it harder. The 2026 collapse was a gift in this sense. It made the invisible visible. It showed us the truth. We might not like the truth. We might wish it were different. But at least we can see it. And seeing it gives us the possibility, however difficult, of responding to it. The crisis didn't end in 2026. It was exposed in 2026. It continues now. It will continue for the foreseeable future. That's the hard truth, but it's the truth. And working from truth, however painful, is the only path to anything better than continued crisis. This is why 2026 didn't end the crisis. It exposed it. And that exposure, properly understood, is what we must work with as we navigate the years ahead. Not denial, not false hope, not waiting for rescue, but clear-eyed recognition of ongoing crisis and sustained effort to adapt to the reality it revealed.